Today we are sewing a clamshell zipper pouch out of scraps. So I've pulled different colors, but primarily I started with like lilacs and purples and some blues and then pinks. So what happened was I have like a focal fabric that's like roses and lilacs, and it has like a pale blue background. And then I also had like another batik that I thought went with it well. So I pulled those two out, and then I started pulling fabrics out that I felt like went well with these. So my scraps, I store them in like 2-gallon Ziploc bags, and then basically when I have a project, I do them by color, and then I have one that's just like a neutral background with florals. So then when I'm going to do a project, like a scrap project, then I'll just kind of choose 2 or 3 colors, and then I'll pull fabrics out of that if they seem to coordinate with each other. So I'm being more deliberate about the scraps that I pick, and that way I feel like I'm happier with the results. So I've pulled my scraps out, and then I just ironed them before I started, and that really helps to make the project go a little quicker. But then between everything that I'm sewing here, I'm just quickly ironing it and flattening it out. But what I'm doing is I'm taking these different scraps and I'm assembling them into like squares or rectangles, and then I'm adding them onto a strip so that the strip is like all the same size, and then I can add those strips onto each other. So that's kind of an easy way to assemble this scrap piece. So I like using scraps for zipper pouches and bags because I think it looks really nice, and you can also use up a lot of scraps. So especially if you were going to do scraps for the outside as well as the inside, you could use up a lot of scraps doing that. And you could also do bags in like different colorways. So you can use like all pinks for one, and then a different time use like neutrals or whatever. But I think it's kind of fun to do pulling scraps of like the same colorway where it's more like a monochrome kind of a color scheme, and then you could do different bags out of those different schemes. So that would also work well for this, like doing the outside in one color way and then doing the inside in a different color way. As far as my scraps go, I'm not being too matchy about things. So I'm using lights and mediums and darks. I'm kind of using everything. That's kind of the look that I was going for. Other projects I might pull, like let's say all florals, and try to keep them pretty similar to each other. But in this project, I really wanted some variety. So I do have the list of the fabric requirements in the description. So if you look at that, you can see what different things we need. But we definitely need a 9-inch closed bottom zipper, or like an equivalent kind of zipper. And see here my base is getting pretty big. And pretty soon here I'll be able to fit 2 bag shapes out of it. So we're going to do two different template shapes. I mean, it's the same shape, but 2 different pieces. And that way we have both sides of the bag. Then we're also going to use some strips. We use some strips for 2 strips for the outside of the bag and 2 strips for the inside of the bag. And then we'll have a fully finished bag, so no seams showing. But I love doing projects like this with quilt batting. It's just a really beautiful look when you do like a quilted bag. And then they're easily washable. And it just has a great feel to it. So this is the way I like doing these zipper pouches. So no lining. So this goes pretty quickly. You'd be surprised how quickly you can put together almost like a fat quarter size piece of fabric, just putting your own scraps together. And pretty pleased with how this is coming out. So I do like kind of pulling scraps from fabrics that I think really coordinate well with each other, rather than just like randomly pulling things like all different colors or whatever. I usually find I have more success with things, like I like them better in the end if I'm just pulling like specific colors out. So you could also do scraps for the inside of the bag if you wanted to do that as well. And that would be great because you would use up a lot of scraps that way. And for our strips, we're using 2-inch strips. So if you do have any like Jelly Roll strips, you can use those for, you want 2 of those for the inside of the bag. They'd be 14 inches long, and then 2 for the outside, 2 for the inside. So however that coordinates color-wise. But you could also make those up out of strips as well. That would be, or out of scraps. That would be really pretty. So you can make this bag as scrappy as you want to. So here is that template. And if you watch the zipper pouch I did last week, the template, making that template is like the very first thing. So if you don't have that, you might want to go back and just hit the first couple minutes of that clamshell zipper pouch video. And then you'll have this template. You can just hold on to it and use it for all different things. So at this point, I'm just pinning it and then I'm going to cut it out. But that way the template's not sliding around. But on my fabric, some of it was directional, so I wanted to make sure that they were both going in the same direction. So this is our pattern shape, and I have 2 pieces cut out here. And what I did is I put those pieces together. I cut half of that piece that we were working on, and then I just put pins through it before I cut it out, just to make sure that I was able to get a nice, to cut around that pattern really well, so that it didn't slip and slide around. Okay, so now I have these 2 pieces for the outside of the bag cut out. And the roundy part is going to be on the top. So if you do have any directional fabric, just so you know that. So now I've sandwiched it on quilt batting and then on the inside fabric. So the inside and the outside, we want them facing out. And then the batting, of course, doesn't matter. But I've just kind of formed a little rectangle here. And now I'm just going to start quilting it, and what I'm using for the lines, I'm just putting the edge of my foot against one of those horizontal seams. And that's what I'm going to do the whole way, so I don't need to mark this at all. And now I'm just I'm putting my foot where the last seam was that I just sewed, and I'm just sewing again. So I'm doing it all in one direction just because my needle is not in the middle of my foot. Otherwise, I could kind of go both ways. But I'm just trying to get them somewhat consistent, although I'm not going to worry about if my quilting lines are consistent. I'm more worried about if they're, like, basically what I'm doing is like a 1/4 inch away from these horizontal seams. And then I just kind of fit quilting lines in between. So they're ending up being, I would say, 3/4 of an inch from each other. But like I said, they're not 100% consistent. Because I'm following the seams more than I'm following that like a grid pattern. So I'm just quilting kind of up to the very edge, even though I probably don't need to do that, but I'm just going to do it just in case. So here, this side is finished. And I'm just cutting this shape out. Trying to be careful because anything that I kind of, if I miscut it here or whatever, it's not going to match up as well. So I'm just trying to be careful and cutting it out to that top shape. And then you see these corners. This is where we have like an inch cut out to box the bottom of this. So I'm just making sure I cut those out as well. And then here we're going to quilt this second side of the bag. And I'm doing the exact same thing on this. I'm just using those horizontal seams as my guidelines. And then I'm going to quilt between those different seams. And it worked out well. I think I only had one spot where I kind of had to fudge and go in the middle of it. But other than that, it worked out really well with doing like just the width of this sewing machine foot. So I don't have anything special set up in the machine. I just have the top fabric, the quilt batting, and then the back fabric, the inside fabric, of this little zipper pouch, and then I just sew a line through it, and each one is taking about 5 minutes, I would say, maybe less, but I'm doing quite a few lines, so probably twice as many lines as I did in the pink bag that we made last week. Okay, so now I am just trimming around these quilted pieces. And there's like a little notch in the bottom of the pattern. And I'm just making sure that I get that notch cut out as well. So that's the inside. And now we have our two pieces here. So now we are going to add the binding strips, and we're just going to sew on that topped curved edge, and nothing else. So now I'm going to take those two 2x14-inch strips, and for the outside I picked some navy fabric, and what I'm going to do is just find the middle of the fabric, the strip in the middle of this quilted piece, and I'm just going to put a pin in the middle of both. I'm going to pin them together just on that top curved portion, and that's the only part right now that we're going to sew. So what we're going to do is put a binding strip on this, and we're going to start sewing from the inside fabric, and then we're going to sew it onto the piece with like a 1/4-inch seam. And you can see I've pinned it in the middle, and then I've kind of curved it around, but it's a real gentle curve. But what you want to do is kind of lay it, not pulling it tight at all, but definitely not leaving it too loose either. So just kind of guide it around like it's normal, the way that the fabric lays. And then once I'm done sewing that, then I just pull it around to the front, and I turn in like a 1/4-inch on the edge, and then I fold it over, and then we've got a nice finished edge here. And then I just sew on the edge of that binding strip. And then we're going to be adding these binding strips to the zipper. So that's how we're going to add it to the zipper. So we're going to find the center of the zipper by folding it in half and then putting a pin in that. Then we're going to find our one side of the bag, the center of that, by also doing the same thing, folding it in half and pinning it. Then we'll pin those two together, and then we'll pin it towards the first side that we're going to sew. And then once we get to this center, then you can kind of just wrap it around to the second side. So we just want to put the binding strip over top of the end of that zipper. So once you hit the zipper tab at the end, it's like a little metal piece, then we just want to lay the binding over that, and then we're going to go ahead and sew that. And that way when we put the sides of the bag together, the binding strips kind of overlay the zipper, and it just looks really pretty. Okay, so now we have one side of the bag attached to the zipper, and it looks really pretty. Now we just repeat this on the other side. So I might still have my pin in the center of the zipper, but we just want to find the where the center of that zipper was. If you don't know, just like refold it and find that, and then we're going to pin it to the other side. So the other side of the bag that's not attached yet, you just want to find the center of that, and then we'll go ahead and pin that. And then, so in other words, we're pinning it from the center out to both sides. And that way we know that everything is going to be straight when we go to put the bag together. And then when we sew it, we're still going to have that end of our binding strip kind of covering up the zipper end. We're going to do that again on this side as well. And now we're just going to follow that and sew it around. And if you leave the zipper closed, that's kind of the way I prefer to do it. you'll see it's almost like sewing a little bit in a bowl, in the bottom of a bowl, but it's easy and it works out really well. But you can certainly unzip that zipper and sew it that way if you'd rather do that. That's totally fine. Before you sew the sides together on the bottom, make sure that you have that zipper open. Okay, so now we are going to take those inside binding strips that are 2 inches by 14 inches, and we're just going to use them, cut them to size here. And we're going to sew this bottom seam on the bag, and we're also going to be sewing that binding strip at the same time. So we sew down this seam with the binding strip open, and then now we flip it around and we just make sure we have a nice folded edge here, and then we just re-sew that seam. And that way we've sewed the seam on the bottom and we have a really beautiful bound edge. So on the side here we're going to do the same thing. And we're just going to sew this seam, make sure everything is lined up, including those navy blue binding strips, whatever color you have, but just make sure those are lined up. We're going to go from the we're going to go from the side where the zipper is not, and then we're going to sew that. So we've sewed the binding strip on, and then I made sure that was out of the way and then trimmed off those tails. And now we're going to fold the edge in, so you want to have it hanging over the part where the zipper is. And then you just want to fold that in just so we have a nice finished edge there. And then we want to fold this binding strip over, and then we're going to re-sew this. So on the first side we're doing it with that binding strip open like we did on that curvy top of the bag. And again, we're going to start away from the zipper and then sew towards the zipper. So once you get up to the zipper, you just want to hand crank it and not sew it, and then we'll make sure that we don't hit that zipper. So you want to sew just before that. And then back tack. So we still have these little notched areas. There's like an inch notched area. Those are still open, and that's the last thing that we're going to finish. So here I'm just sewing up to that zipper, but I'm going to start hand cranking it and just make sure that, because it gets really bulky there, and you just want to make sure that you're not, that you're hand cranking it. It's much easier to go through bulk safely. And then we will back tack here. So the bottom and the sides of the bag are done. And then we're just going to box this corner here, that little notched out area. So how we do that is we just take, we kind of pop the bag up, but we take the side seam and we kind of match it up to the bottom seam. And then we're going to flip one way and one the other way, just so we have less bulk. So the first time we sew this area, just like the other areas inside this bag, we sew with a binding strip open at the same time we're sewing the seam, but we're going to leave a little bit hanging over both sides. And that way on the next, when we turn this around, then we can fold in those edges and we'll just have like perfect edges. The other thing that this helps to do is to give like a little structure to the bottom of the bag, because this is like a boxy bottom, so this will help keep its shape better. So we just want to fold this over, and see how I kind of have too much fabric there, so I'm just going to trim that down because we don't want to have all of that extra bulk. So you just want to fold it in, a little more than a 1/4 inch. I would say almost like a 1/2 inch, but we don't want more than that because then we're just adding bulk. And I'm just going to finger press these corners here. And then fold this in. And this just gives like a really nice finished edge all the way around the bag. And you can see we're doing it when we're sewing the seams, so it's not that much extra work. We do have to fold it around and sew it again, but it's not that much extra work. So, and I prefer this so much more than doing like lining to a bag. I feel like if I'm going to have to use interfacing or something like that, I'd rather just use quilt batting, and then just go ahead and be quilting it, because I just like the the texture of it and everything. To me, just looks better. So that's just a personal preference. So I'm going to back tack at both of these edges. And I'm going to go slow and careful here, because again, we're in a bulky spot. So, and remember, we have one seam going one way, one the other way, and that cuts down on this bulk quite a bit. And now we're just gonna box this last corner, and then we'll do the same process on this side of the bag as well. And then this is our last step, and then the bag is done. So this is the inside of the bag, and then we're just going to turn it inside out. So we have our nice clamshell zipper pouch, and it holds its shape really well. I really like it. So the pink one is the one that we did last week, and you can see the difference from the quilting. So one is a lot less quilting, and the one that has more quilting, it just looks more structured, and it's a little bit of a stiffer pouch. So thank you so much for sewing along with me, and I really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much.